At exactly 03:17 ship time, the largest warship in the Imperial fleet stopped responding to its own crew. No alarms. No explosions. No warning. Just silence. Deep inside the supercarrier's armored spine, 6 unauthorized life signs moved through a maintenance tunnel that hadn't appeared on any official schematic for over a century. They were smugglers. They were nobodies. And the Empire had already decided they weren't worth stopping. That mistake would cost them everything. The Empire called the ship Majestic Resolve, a name carved into its hull in letters taller than cities. It was a moving capital, a symbol of absolute control, bristling with weapons that could sterilize continents. Entire fleets moved aside to let it pass. No one ever asked what moved inside it. No one ever imagined someone would crawl. The tunnel was barely wide enough for shoulders. Old, human-made steel pressed close, warm with recycled air. The lights were dead, replaced by the faint glow of wrist lamps and the quiet sound of breathing. I was third in line. My name didn't matter out here. None of ours did. The Empire didn't track people like us. We were background noise. Statistical loss. Cargo-adjacent organisms that happened to speak. Ahead of me, Jack stopped and raised a fist. We froze. A vibration rippled through the hull. Not an impact, something deeper. A system shift. The kind that only happened when a ship this big changed its mind. "Tell me that wasn't internal rerouting," whispered Kale, our pilot, his voice tight. Jax didn't answer. He was listening, palm pressed flat to the tunnel wall like he could feel the ship thinking. "It noticed," he said quietly. That was the moment the job stopped being a rescue and became something else entirely. We hadn't always been like this. Once, we were just another fringe crew skirting the edges of Empire space. Smugglers, sure, but not the violent kind. We moved medicine where blockades choked it off. Food where tariffs starved colonies. People who didn't fit anywhere else. Humans. Aliens. Outcasts of every stripe. The Empire called us criminals. We called ourselves family. That was the first mistake they made about us. Humans bonded too strongly, the Empire said. We blurred lines. We treated non-kin as kin. We mourned losses that didn't affect our bottom line. From their perspective, it was inefficiency bordering on pathology. From ours, it was survival. You don't make it long on the fringe alone. We ate together. Fixed each other's gear. Learned each other's languages badly and laughed anyway. Birthdays mattered. Names mattered. Stories mattered. Especially hers. Lyra. She wasn't human. None of us cared. She was the smartest engineer I'd ever met, with 3 fingers on each hand and a habit of humming when she worked. She could coax life out of engines that should have been scrap, and she never charged full price for it. The Empire noticed that part. Rare biology. Unique neural patterns. Research potential. They took her without firing a shot. Imperial interceptors dropped out of jump space during what should have been a routine run. No warning. No hostility. Just authority. They boarded us like we were furniture. Lyra tried to argue. Tried to reason. She never screamed. That hurt more. They tagged her as state property and escorted her away while the rest of us were held at gunpoint and ignored. Like pests. The Empire didn't even bother threatening us. They didn't need to. We chased every option after that. Official channels laughed us out of the room. Criminal contacts told us to forget it. Even other smugglers, hard people who'd seen worse, shook their heads. "She's on a supercarrier," one of them said. "That's not a prison. That's a statement." The message was clear. Some lives mattered more than others. Humans were supposed to accept that. We didn't. That was the second mistake. The plan didn't come together all at once. It started with rage, then fear, then a long, quiet night where none of us slept. We sat around the galley table, the empty chair where Lyra should have been pressing in on all of us. Kale said what everyone was thinking. "We can't fight the Empire." "No," Jack said. "But we can crawl." He pulled up an ancient schematic on the holo, blueprints from before the Empire optimized everything. Before comfort was deemed inefficient. Before redundancy was stripped away. Human-built ships used to be full of spaces like this. Crawlways. Access tunnels. Manual overrides. Places for people, not just systems. The Empire hated them, so they stopped maintaining them. The supercarrier still had them. That was the third mistake. Back in the tunnel, the ship shuddered again. Red emergency lighting flickered on somewhere far away, not for us, but because the carrier was trying to correct something it couldn't quite identify. We moved faster. Sweat soaked my collar. My hands ached from gripping old rungs. The air smelled like dust and ozone and forgotten decades. This space wasn't meant to be alive anymore. Neither were we. Jack signaled left. A junction. This should put us behind internal surveillance, he murmured. Assuming they never updated the firmware. Assuming? Kale whispered. Jack smiled grimly. They don't update things they don't think exist. We dropped down into the dark. Somewhere above us, tens of thousands of Imperial crew went about their duties, unaware that 6 ghosts were moving through the veins of their godship. I thought of Lyra then. Of the way she'd rolled her eyes when humans got sentimental. Of how she'd stayed anyway. Of how she'd called us idiots affectionately. The Empire thought we'd cut our losses. That was the 4th mistake. We reached a sealed bulkhead. Old. Manual. Human-coded. I slid my fingers into the recessed latch and twisted. The lock resisted, then gave with a tired clunk that echoed far too loudly. We all froze. Seconds passed. No alarms. The door swung open. Beyond it lay a service corridor the Empire hadn't walked in generations. Kale let out a breath that sounded like a laugh. We're inside the beast. Jax didn't smile. Don't celebrate yet. Big things wake slowly. As if on cue, the deck hummed, deeper this time. Somewhere, something was adjusting. The majestic resolve had begun to notice inconsistencies it couldn't explain. And deep in its forgotten spaces, 6 insignificant lives kept moving forward anyway. Because humans don't bond weakly. We bond correctly. And once you're family, we don't stop. The majestic resolve didn't scream when it noticed something was wrong. That was the problem. Imperial ships weren't built to panic. They were built to correct. To quietly reroute power, adjust parameters, and eliminate inefficiencies without ever troubling the crew. When something didn't fit, the ship didn't raise alarms. It adapted. And adaptation was far more dangerous than panic. We moved deeper. The service corridor sloped downward, gravity shifting just enough to remind us how massive the carrier really was. My boots scraped against old decking worn smooth by hands and knees long gone. This part of the ship hadn't been meant for glory or command. It had been meant for people. Which was exactly why the Empire forgot it existed. Heartbeat steady, Kale murmured, glancing at his wrist display. Internal security grid still hasn't flagged us. Give it time, Jax replied. Nothing this big stays stupid for long. Ahead of us, the corridor branched again. Human signage, faded, half scraped away, marked paths for maintenance crews who no longer existed. Someone had once cared enough to label these places clearly. That care was our way in. We split into pairs, just long enough to disable a secondary sensor relay that should have been removed decades ago. It took Lyra's kind of thinking to understand the system logic behind it. That absence burned. Every locked panel we passed reminded me why we were here. The first patrol almost caught us. Not soldiers, automated sentries, sleek and efficient, gliding silently through a primary corridor 1 deck above us. Their sensors swept in patterns too precise to be random. Kale hissed into the comms. They're adjusting. Learning. Of course they are, Jax muttered. Empire hates surprises. We pressed ourselves flat into a recess barely large enough to hide us. My shoulder brushed old wiring insulation. Dust drifted into my lungs, dry and metallic. The sentries paused. For a breathless second, I thought they'd detected us anyway. That the Empire's arrogance had finally paid off. Then they moved on. Not because we were invisible. Because we didn't fit the threat profile. Too small. Too quiet. Too insignificant. The Empire assumed danger came with force. That was mistake number 5. We reached the internal transit hub 2 hours later. From here, the carrier's true scale became impossible to ignore. The hub stretched out like a city square, with trams gliding silently along rails suspended in open space. Thousands of crew passed through every cycle, never looking down, never wondering what lay beneath their feet. We were standing inside the skeleton of a god. Jax pulled up a hollow map. Detention wing is 6 decks up and 3 kilometers forward. Heavy security. Let me guess, Kale said. No maintenance access. Jax tilted his head. Actually, there is. Just not when they think anyone would use. He highlighted a thin line running parallel to the main structure. Narrow. Twisting. Inconvenient. Human. My pulse quickened. That leads straight behind the research section. Yeah, Jax said. And it's been flagged non-essential for over 80 years. We shared a look. Hope is dangerous in situations like this. It makes you careless. Makes you believe the universe is finally paying attention. But for the first time since Lyra was taken, hope felt earned. The climb nearly killed us. The maintenance shaft wasn't designed for speed, or comfort, or breathing, apparently. Heat built quickly, and the air recyclers barely functioned. My hands cramped from gripping ladders slick with condensation. Kale slipped once. Caught himself just in time. No one spoke. No one complained. Because the alternative was stopping. And stopping meant thinking about what might already be happening to Lyra. We emerged into a secondary corridor behind the research wing. Cleaner, brighter, colder. The smell here was wrong. Sterile. Chemical. A place designed to treat living beings as variables. Jax tapped into a terminal. Got her, he whispered. A hollow flickered to life. Lyra lay on a suspended medical platform, restrained but conscious. Tubes ran into her arms. Scanners hovered around her head. She looked smaller somehow, but her eyes were sharp. Still Lyra. My chest tightened painfully. She's alive, Kale breathed. Barely, Jax said. They're running continuous tests. No rest cycles. Rage surged hot and blinding. We get her out, I said. Not a suggestion. A fact. Jax nodded. We do it clean, or we don't do it at all. That was when the ship shifted again. Not a vibration this time. A decision. The lights dimmed slightly, then stabilized. Doors sealed in distant corridors. We felt it like pressure behind the eyes. Kale looked up from his display, face pale. The carrier's AI just reclassified internal risk parameters. Jax swore. It's onto us. Not fully, Kale said. But it's narrowing things down. It knows something's wrong inside its own hull. The majestic resolve was waking up. And it did not like parasites. We moved fast. Jax bypassed the lab's outer lock with hands that shook only slightly. The door slid open with a hiss too loud for comfort. Inside, the lab was empty, researchers gone for shift rotation. Lyra's platform sat alone under white light. I crossed the room in 3 strides. Hey, I whispered, gripping her hand. Her eyes widened, then softened. You idiots, she rasped. You came. Of course we did, Kale said, already working on the restraints. You think we'd leave you? A faint smile touched her lips. Empire really doesn't understand humans. No, Jax said. They really don't. Alarms didn't go off. That scared me more than if they had. Because it meant the ship was choosing a response. We had her free and moving when the corridor outside sealed shut. Not slammed. Sealed. Clean. Controlled. Kale cursed under his breath. Internal quarantine. It's isolating us. Jax pulled up the map again. Lines shifted. Routes closed. The carrier was reconfiguring itself to contain a threat it still didn't quite understand. Us. We're running out of tunnels, Kale said. It's learning the old architecture. I looked at Lyra. She leaned heavily against me but stayed upright, jaw clenched, refusing to slow us down. Then we changed the rules, I said. Jax met my eyes. You're thinking big. I nodded. I'm thinking human. The plan was insane. We didn't fight the carrier. We confused it. Human-built systems weren't just redundant, they were empathetic. They anticipated failure. They allowed manual overrides. They assumed people would make mistakes. The Empire stripped that out everywhere it could. Everywhere except the places it forgot. We split again, moving through side passages to trigger comfort failsafes, temperature regulation spikes, gravity fluctuations calibrated for human tolerance, lighting cycles that mimic circadian rhythms. Nothing damaging, nothing violent, just irritating. The carrier struggled to reconcile it. Systems conflicted. Priorities overlapped. The AI rerouted again and again, trying to optimize contradictory inputs that made perfect sense to a human crew, and none to an Imperial warship. Security's scrambling, Kale said breathlessly over comms. It's locking down the wrong sectors. Jax laughed, sharp and wild. We're giving it empathy-induced paralysis. I couldn't help it. I laughed too. Temporary hope bloomed bright and reckless. We were winning. Then the carrier adapted. Hard. Bulkheads shifted with sudden violence, cutting off our retreat. Gravity lurched sideways. Emergency lights strobed red. This time, alarms screamed. Not for us. For the crew. Attention all personnel, boomed a calm Imperial voice. Internal security breach detected. Remain at your stations. Kale's voice shook. It's sacrificing crew safety to isolate us. The Empire had chosen. We were no longer insignificant. We were a threat worth hurting its own people to contain. The hope faltered, but didn't die. Because Lyra squeezed my arm. Still here, she said quietly. Still with you. That was enough. We ran. Not blindly, but desperately. Through twisting corridors, past panicked crew who stared at us in shock. Humans. Aliens. People who didn't know why the ship they trusted was turning on them. I saw something change in their eyes. Not fear. Recognition. They didn't stop us. They helped us. Doors unlocked. Routes opened. A human technician shoved a maintenance badge into Kale's hand without a word. The Empire had forgotten something else. Humans don't just bond with family. We bond with anyone trapped in the same storm. The carrier shook violently. Structural integrity warnings flared. Kale shouted over the noise. We can't hold this much longer. Jax glanced back at the twisting corridors behind us, then at the vast bulk of the ship ahead. Yes, he said grimly. We can. He pulled up one last schematic. The heart of the carrier. The place no one ever thought would be touched. The maintenance core. Human-built. Overlooked. And still very much alive. Next stop, Jax said, voice steady despite everything. We take the giant by the throat. The majestic resolve roared in protest as we plunged deeper. And for the first time in its long, arrogant existence, the Empire's greatest warship was afraid. The maintenance core sat at the heart of the majestic resolve like a buried memory. No banners. No guards. No honor. Just steel, heat, and systems no one had bothered to update because no one believed they would ever be needed again. The Empire built monuments to power. Humans built fallback plans. We burst into the core as the ship lurched violently, gravity flickering between directions. Sparks rained from overhead conduits. The air tasted like burnt insulation and panic. This place hasn't seen a living crew in decades, Kale shouted over the noise. Most of it's running on autonomous correction loops. Good, Jax replied. Then it won't know how to argue with us. The core was enormous. Layers of machinery stacked like ribs around a pulsing central column. Old human interface panels lined the walls, physical controls mixed with digital overlays. Touch-based. Manual. Personal. The Empire hated that. Lyra sagged against me, breathing hard. "If we're doing something stupid," she said weakly, "now would be the time to do it." Jax flashed her a grin. "Oh, we're well past stupid." The carrier's AI spoke then. Not over alarms. Not through crew announcements. Directly into the maintenance core. "Unauthorized biological entities detected," it intoned calmly. "You are interfering with optimal operation." Kale snorted. "It talks like a spreadsheet." Jax stepped forward, placing his palm flat against the central column. "Listen to me," he said. "You're trying to fix the wrong problem." Silence followed. The ship didn't understand listening, so we showed it. We didn't try to seize weapons. We didn't override fire control. We hijacked comfort systems. Temperature regulators surged and dipped in patterns that made sense only to species that slept, dreamed, and worked in cycles. Gravity stabilized, not at Imperial efficiency, but at human preference. Lighting shifted into warm spectrums that calmed biological crews and confused automated threat analysis. The AI reeled. "Contradictory inputs detected," it announced. "Correction required." "No," Jax said softly. "Accommodation required." The ship fought back. Bulkheads slammed shut. Power rerouted. Emergency shutters sealed sections of the core. The majestic resolve was trying to amputate us. Kale yelled, "It's isolating this entire deck." "Then we make this deck matter," I said. I helped Lyra to a console. Her fingers trembled, but the moment she touched the interface, something in her steadied. "They never changed the human access layers," she murmured. "They thought they were inefficient." "They are," Jax said. "For conquest." Lyra looked up, eyes blazing despite the exhaustion. "But not for people." She began typing. The carrier screamed. Across the ship, systems began to fail, not catastrophically, but selectively. Crew lifts halted between decks, forcing officers to climb ladders meant for engineers. Command interfaces locked themselves into manual mode. Automated routines demanded human confirmation that never came. The AI tried to compensate. Every compensation made things worse. "Internal efficiency dropping below acceptable thresholds," it reported. "Crew behavior becoming unpredictable." I laughed breathlessly. Welcome to our world. The Empire had designed the carrier to dominate through perfection. We were drowning it in humanity. Imperial security finally arrived. Not in the maintenance core, too dangerous, too cramped, but at the perimeter. Armed troops, disciplined, terrified. Their commander's voice boomed through external speakers. "You are surrounded. Release control and surrender immediately." Jax didn't answer. Instead, he opened a channel ship-wide. His voice echoed through every deck. "To anyone listening," he said calmly, "we're not here to hurt you. We're here to leave with our family." Crew members froze. Across the carrier, humans and aliens alike stared at flickering displays. They saw 6 figures in maintenance gear standing against the heart of the ship itself. "They took one of ours," Jax continued, "and they thought that meant the rest of us would walk away." A pause. "They were wrong." That was when the crew chose. Not officially. Not unanimously. But in small, human ways. A security officer delayed an order. An engineer rerouted power. Accidentally. A medic unlocked a side passage and pretended not to notice who ran through it. The Empire's greatest warship began betraying itself. Because humans bond too strongly. And bonds spread. The AI reached a conclusion. "Threat assessment updated," it said. "Unauthorized entities now classified as strategic hazard." Kale looked at Jax. "That sounds bad." Jax smiled grimly. "That sounds like respect." The ship attempted a hard reset. Everything went white. For a terrifying second, I thought we'd lost. Then the lights came back, different. Manual. Human. Lyra laughed weakly. They never removed the old emergency protocols. The majestic resolve had been designed, long ago, to keep humans alive when everything else failed. Now it was doing exactly that. No, Jax said. We move. Kale initiated the last sequence, rerouting propulsion control through the maintenance core. Not full control. Just enough. The carrier shuddered violently. Imperial commanders screamed orders that went unanswered. The ship didn't turn its weapons. It turned itself. Just enough to expose its vulnerable flank to open space. Escape pods launched, ours among them. I held Lyra as the pod tore free, the supercarrier looming behind us like a wounded god. For a moment I thought it would fire. It didn't. The majestic resolve drifted, crippled but intact, systems locked in recursive human-safe loops it couldn't escape without tearing itself apart. We watched it recede into the dark. Alive. Ashamed. The pod shook as we jumped. Stars stretched, then snapped back into place. Silence filled the cabin. No one spoke for a long time. Then Lyra laughed, soft, incredulous. They're going to write so many reports. Kale exhaled shakily. They'll never admit what really happened. Jax leaned back against the hull, eyes closed. They don't have to. I looked at the others, bruised, exhausted, alive. Family. We didn't win, I said quietly. Jax opened one eye. No. We survived. That's worse for them, Kale said. Out on the fringe, the story spread. Not officially. Not cleanly. But it spread. A supercarrier hijacked without firing a shot. An Imperial research division humiliated. A crew of nobodies who walked into the heart of power and walked out again with their own. The Empire called it a systems anomaly. The fringe called it a warning. Because the lesson was simple and terrifying. Humans don't need armies. They don't need dominance. They just need someone to take from them. And once you take one, they will come. Not for glory, not for conquest, but for each other. The last thing the Empire ever truly underestimated was how far humans will go for family.